Are you experiencing unexplained pain that doctors cannot diagnose, emotional wounds that don't heal through normal means, or spiritual burdens that seem too heavy for your soul to bear? What you're feeling may not be random suffering. It could be the sacred wounds that mark God's chosen vessels, the unique spiritual pains that only those selected for extraordinary kingdom purposes are privileged to experience. While others live in comfortable spiritual ignorance, you've been chosen to feel what breaks God's heart, see what destroys human souls, and carry burdens that transform not just your life, but the lives of everyone God places within your sphere of influence. These 7 spiritual pains aren't signs of divine displeasure. They're evidence of divine selection, proof that God has marked you for purposes so significant that He's willing to entrust you with suffering that prepares you for supernatural authority and eternal impact that will echo through generations. Those chosen by God to carry His purposes in the earth experience a unique form of spiritual pain that comes from seeing the spiritual reality behind what others perceive as normal circumstances. This divine vision creates what could be called prophetic grief, the overwhelming sorrow that comes from witnessing the spiritual destruction surrounding people who remain unaware of their eternal danger. When God opens your spiritual eyes to see the demonic oppression affecting your loved ones, the generational curses operating in families, and the spiritual blindness that keeps entire communities trapped in cycles of defeat, the weight of this revelation can feel unbearable. You watch people make decisions that you know will lead to destruction, yet they cannot see the spiritual forces influencing their choices or the eternal consequences of their actions. The burden intensifies when you realize that most people, including fellow believers, cannot see what you see, and often resist or reject your attempts to warn them about spiritual dangers. This creates profound isolation because your reality includes dimensions that others dismiss as imagination, religious extremism, or mental instability. You witness spiritual attacks against churches, demonic infiltration in Christian organizations, and occult influences in seemingly innocent activities. But speaking about these observations often results in rejection, ridicule, or accusations of being judgmental. The pain of seeing clearly while being unable to effectively communicate what you see creates a loneliness that can only be understood by others who carry similar prophetic gifting. The emotional toll of prophetic vision includes experiencing God's heart for situations and people in ways that produce physical and emotional symptoms. When God shows you His grief over sin, His anger toward injustice, and His love for lost souls, these divine emotions can overwhelm your human nervous system and create depression, anxiety, and physical illness that medical professionals cannot adequately diagnose or treat. You feel God's heartbreak over broken marriages, His fury toward child abuse, and His compassion for the oppressed with an intensity that seems to tear your soul apart. This empathetic connection to divine emotions serves God's purposes, but creates suffering that people without prophetic calling cannot comprehend. The responsibility that accompanies divine vision creates crushing pressure, because you understand that seeing spiritual truth makes you accountable for responding appropriately to what God reveals. When God shows you someone's spiritual condition, their destiny, or their need for intervention, you become responsible for praying, speaking, or acting according to His direction. The weight of knowing that your obedience or disobedience could affect someone's eternal destiny, their healing, or their breakthrough creates stress that affects every area of your life. You cannot unknow what God has shown you, and the burden of carrying divine secrets while waiting for God's timing to reveal or act upon them requires supernatural grace. The persecution that often follows prophetic vision adds another layer of spiritual pain as religious people, family members, and friends misunderstand your calling and oppose your ministry. Those who walk in prophetic gifting frequently experience rejection from the very people they're called to serve, criticism from religious leaders who feel threatened by their revelations, and isolation from family members who are uncomfortable with their spiritual intensity. The pain of being misunderstood by those you love most, while carrying divine burden for their spiritual welfare, creates emotional agony that tests your commitment to God's calling and your willingness to continue seeing what he wants to show you. The warfare dimension of prophetic vision attracts increased demonic attack because enemy forces recognize the threat that divinely enlightened people represent to their kingdom operations. When you see spiritual truth clearly, you become a target for retaliation through physical illness, financial attack, relationship problems, and mental oppression designed to silence your voice and diminish your effectiveness. The spiritual pain of constant warfare, combined with the isolation of carrying divine vision, creates what many prophetic people describe as feeling like they're living in two worlds simultaneously, the natural world that others see and the spiritual world that God reveals. Learning to navigate both realms while maintaining emotional stability and spiritual effectiveness requires divine grace that can only come through intimate relationship with God and understanding that your suffering serves eternal purposes that transcend temporary comfort. God's chosen vessels invariably experience extended seasons of testing that feel like spiritual exile in barren places where His presence seems distant and His promises appear forgotten. This wilderness experience serves to develop character, eliminate self-reliance, and prepare you for greater levels of spiritual authority. But the pain of these seasons can feel like divine abandonment. Unlike temporary trials that most believers face, the wilderness seasons of chosen ones often last months or years and involve systematic stripping away of natural supports, human relationships, and familiar spiritual experiences. You find yourself in places, geographically, emotionally, or spiritually, where you must learn to hear God's voice without external confirmation and trust His character without visible evidence of His activity. The isolation that characterizes wilderness seasons creates profound loneliness that cannot be relieved through human companionship because the testing requires learning to find complete satisfaction in God alone. Friends may desert you, family members may misunderstand your journey, and fellow believers may offer shallow advice that demonstrates their inability to comprehend the depth of your spiritual process. The pain of isolation becomes particularly acute when you realize that the very people who should understand your spiritual journey are often the ones who criticize, abandon, or attempt to redirect you away from the path God has chosen for your development. This loneliness serves divine purposes, but creates emotional pain that tests your commitment to God's will above human approval. The stripping process that occurs during wilderness seasons systematically removes everything you've used as sources of identity, security, and comfort outside of your relationship with God. This might include loss of ministry position, financial resources, health, relationships, or even spiritual experiences that had previously confirmed God's presence in your life. The pain of having these supports removed feels like spiritual death because they represented evidence of God's favor and blessing. Yet this stripping is necessary to eliminate dependencies that would hinder your effectiveness in future ministry and to develop total reliance on God's character rather than His gifts or blessings. The testing of faith that occurs in wilderness seasons involves situations where God's promises seem to contradict your circumstances and His faithfulness appears questionable based on natural observation. You may experience financial pressure despite promises of provision, health challenges despite promises of healing, or relational conflicts despite promises of favor. The spiritual pain comes from the cognitive dissonance between what you know about God's character and what you experience in your circumstances. This testing serves to develop unshakable faith that's based on God's nature rather than situational evidence. But the process requires enduring apparent contradictions that create mental and emotional stress. The duration uncertainty that characterizes wilderness seasons creates additional psychological pressure because you have no clear timeline for when the testing will end or what specific lessons must be learned before graduation occurs. Unlike educational programs with defined curricula and graduation dates, spiritual wilderness experience provides few markers of progress and no guaranteed completion schedule. You must learn to be faithful in the present moment without knowing whether your season will last days, months, or years. This uncertainty tests your willingness to serve God for His sake alone rather than for the rewards or recognition that ministry might bring. The purpose revelation that eventually emerges from wilderness seasons shows that every form of pain, loss, and difficulty served to prepare you for spiritual authority and ministry effectiveness that wouldn't have been possible without the character development that suffering produced. The wilderness stripping eliminated pride, self-reliance, and human dependencies that would have hindered your ability to serve others effectively or handle the spiritual authority God intended to entrust to you. The isolation taught you to hear God's voice clearly without external confirmation, enabling you to provide guidance to others who are struggling to discern His direction. The testing developed unshakable faith that qualifies you to encourage others during their seasons of doubt and apparent divine silence. Understanding the purpose behind wilderness pain doesn't eliminate the suffering, but it provides hope that your current season is preparing you for future ministry that will impact many lives and advance God's kingdom in ways that justify every moment of preparation, pain you've endured. Those called to high levels of intercession experience a unique form of spiritual pain that comes from literally bearing the spiritual burdens of others in prayer until breakthrough occurs or divine release comes. This intercessory suffering goes beyond normal prayer concern to include experiencing the actual spiritual, emotional, and sometimes physical conditions of those for whom you're praying. When God calls you to intercede for someone's salvation, healing, or deliverance, you may experience their depression, feel their physical pain, or carry their spiritual oppression as if it were your own condition. This supernatural burden-bearing serves to motivate persistent prayer and create empathetic understanding. But the pain can be overwhelming when you're carrying multiple burdens simultaneously. The intensity of intercessory pain often correlates with the spiritual significance of the situation and the level of demonic resistance opposing the breakthrough you're seeking. When praying for someone's deliverance from addiction, you might experience withdrawal symptoms, cravings, and emotional turmoil that mirror their struggle. When interceding for someone's healing, you may develop physical symptoms that match their condition until their breakthrough occurs. This supernatural identification with others' conditions creates genuine suffering that tests your commitment to intercession and your willingness to pay personal prices for others' spiritual victories. The pain serves to sustain prayer intensity during long spiritual battles and ensures that your intercession is motivated by genuine compassion rather than religious duty. The warfare dimension of intercession attracts direct demonic attack against intercessors because effective prayer threatens enemy operations and advances God's kingdom purposes. When you consistently intercede for others' freedom, salvation, and breakthrough, demon forces recognize you as a strategic threat and target you with retaliation designed to discourage your prayer life and diminish your effectiveness. This retaliation might include physical illness, financial pressure, relationship conflicts, and mental oppression that seems unrelated to your intercession, but actually represents enemy attempts to silence your prayer voice. The spiritual pain of constant warfare while carrying others' burdens creates cumulative stress that requires supernatural grace and clear understanding of your calling to maintain long-term effectiveness. The emotional toll of intercession includes experiencing God's heart for lost and suffering people in ways that produce grief, anger, and compassion beyond normal human capacity. When God gives you His heart for an abortion clinic, a drug-infested neighborhood, or a spiritually dead church, the intensity of divine emotions can overwhelm your psychological and physical systems. You feel God's anger toward injustice, His grief over sin, and His love for lost souls with supernatural intensity that creates symptoms ranging from insomnia and anxiety to physical illness and emotional instability. This divine emotional overflow serves to motivate effective intercession, but requires learning to process supernatural emotions without being destroyed by their intensity. The isolation factor in intercessory calling comes from carrying burdens that others cannot see or understand while being unable to share specific details about many of your prayer assignments. God often gives intercessors confidential information about people's spiritual conditions, future events, or hidden situations that require prayer but cannot be discussed with others. This creates loneliness because your most significant spiritual activity remains invisible and unappreciated by those who benefit from your intercession. You carry the weight of knowing things that burden your heart while being unable to seek prayer support or emotional encouragement from others who might judge, gossip, or misunderstand the information God has entrusted to you. The breakthrough joy that eventually comes from successful intercession provides divine compensation that makes the suffering worthwhile and motivates continued commitment to this costly form of ministry. When someone receives salvation after months of agonizing prayer, when healing manifests after carrying their pain in intercession, or when deliverance occurs after spiritual warfare that affected your entire life, the joy of victory exceeds the memory of suffering and confirms that your pain served eternal purposes. The breakthrough often includes divine revelation about how your suffering enabled others' freedom and understanding that your willingness to bear burdens qualified you to participate in miraculous interventions that changed destinies and advanced God's kingdom. This experiential knowledge that intercession pain produces spiritual victories sustains intercessors through future assignments and creates unshakable commitment to costly prayer ministry that serves others at personal expense but brings tremendous joy when breakthrough occurs. Those chosen for spiritual leadership experience a unique form of loneliness that comes from carrying responsibilities, making decisions, and bearing burdens that cannot be shared with those they're called to serve. This leadership isolation begins when God entrusts you with vision, revelation, or direction that others are not yet ready to receive or understand. You see the path forward, understand the necessary changes, and recognize the spiritual challenges facing your ministry or community, but you must often move forward with limited human support or understanding. The pain of carrying divine vision alone while gradually leading others toward truth they cannot yet see creates emotional strain that tests your commitment to God's calling and your willingness to endure misunderstanding for the sake of obedience. The decision-making burden that accompanies spiritual leadership includes responsibility for choices that affect others' spiritual welfare, financial security, and life direction. When God calls you to make decisions about church direction, ministry focus, or organizational changes, you must often choose between options that will please different groups while potentially disappointing or alienating others. The weight of knowing that your decisions will impact people's spiritual growth, financial stability, and family welfare creates stress that affects every area of your life. You cannot make choices based solely on popularity or personal preference, but must seek God's will, even when His direction conflicts with human wisdom or congregational desires. The spiritual warfare intensity that targets leaders creates attacks designed to discourage, discredit, and defeat those who are advancing God's kingdom purposes through their ministries. Enemy forces recognize that defeating leaders affects entire congregations and ministry organizations, so the attacks against chosen leaders are often more severe and sustained than those targeting average believers. This might include health attacks, financial pressure, family conflicts, and character assassination attempts designed to destroy your credibility and effectiveness. The pain of constant spiritual battle while trying to maintain ministry effectiveness and family stability requires supernatural grace and clear understanding that increased opposition often indicates increased effectiveness in kingdom advancement. The disappointment factor in leadership comes from discovering that people you trusted, invested in, and loved sometimes betray, abandon, or attack you when their personal interests conflict with God's direction for the ministry. The pain of being hurt by those you've served sacrificially creates disillusionment that can affect your ability to trust others and continue giving yourself vulnerably to ministry relationships. You learn that positional leadership attracts people with mixed motives, some genuinely called to serve God's purposes, and others seeking personal benefit, recognition, or control. The process of discerning people's true motives while maintaining love and hope for their spiritual development creates emotional complexity that requires wisdom beyond human capacity. The criticism and misunderstanding that invariably accompany leadership decisions create ongoing emotional pain because you're often criticized for choices that others cannot fully understand due to their limited perspective or spiritual maturity. When God directs you to make changes that seem unnecessary to others, to invest resources in ways that appear unwise, or to take risks that seem foolish, the resulting criticism can be particularly painful because you cannot always explain the divine reasoning behind your decisions. The isolation intensifies when you must maintain confidence in God's direction despite opposition from people whose opinions you value and whose support you need for ministry effectiveness. The stewardship weight that characterizes chosen leadership includes understanding that you'll give account to God for how you handled the people, resources, and opportunities He entrusted to your care. This accountability awareness creates constant pressure to make decisions that advance God's kingdom rather than building your own reputation or securing your personal comfort. You recognize that spiritual leadership is temporary stewardship that requires sacrificing personal preferences for kingdom purposes and using your authority to serve others rather than being served by them. The pain of consistent self-sacrifice while bearing responsibility for outcomes you cannot completely control requires supernatural grace and unshakable confidence in God's ultimate justice and reward for faithful service. Understanding that leadership isolation serves to develop character, humility, and dependence on God, rather than human approval, helps sustain chosen leaders through seasons of loneliness and misunderstanding while preparing them for greater spiritual authority that will benefit many people and advance God's purposes in the earth. Those called to prophetic ministry experience the unique pain of being rejected, criticized, and persecuted for delivering messages that God requires them to speak, regardless of audience reception. This rejection creates deep emotional wounds because it comes from the very people the prophet is called to serve and love. Unlike other forms of ministry that generally receive positive response from those being served, prophetic ministry often produces opposition, anger, and hostility from recipients who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The prophet must speak God's words, knowing that the message will likely be rejected and that speaking truth will probably damage relationships with people they care about deeply. The burden of carrying divine messages that expose sin, warn of judgment, or call for repentance creates internal conflict because the prophet's human heart wants to maintain peaceful relationships, while their spiritual calling requires speaking words that disturb, convict, and challenge. This tension between human desire for acceptance and divine mandate for truth-telling creates ongoing stress that affects the prophet's emotional well-being and social relationships. You find yourself compelled to speak messages that you know will be unpopular, that will cost you friendships, and that will generate opposition from religious and secular authorities who prefer maintaining status quo to confronting spiritual reality. The timing challenges of prophetic ministry add another layer of pain because God's messages often come with divine timing that conflicts with human preferences for convenience and comfort. You may be required to speak correction during celebration seasons, warn of judgment during times of prosperity, or call for repentance when people want to hear encouragement. The prophetic burden doesn't accommodate social calendars, personal relationships, or political considerations. When God gives a message, it must be delivered regardless of circumstances or consequences. This divine timing often ensures maximum impact, but also maximum resistance and personal cost for the messenger. The misinterpretation and distortion of prophetic messages creates additional pain as people twist your words, take statements out of context, or attribute motivations to you that contradict your actual heart and intentions. Religious opponents often accuse prophets of being judgmental, unloving, or spiritually proud when they're actually operating from divine compulsion and genuine love for those they're warning. Secular critics dismiss prophetic messages as religious extremism or mental instability, while spiritual warfare ensures that your words are misunderstood and your character is attacked by those who cannot discern the difference between human opinion and divine revelation. The isolation that results from consistent prophetic ministry comes from the fact that few people understand the burden of carrying divine messages or the cost of speaking unpopular truths. Other believers often distance themselves from prophets to avoid being associated with controversial messages or being convicted by revelations that challenge their own spiritual condition. Family members may be embarrassed by your prophetic calling and pressure you to be more normal in your spiritual expression. The loneliness of carrying divine burden while being misunderstood by those you love creates emotional pain that tests your commitment to obedience and your willingness to continue serving as God's spokesman regardless of personal cost. The vindication that eventually comes when prophetic messages prove accurate provides divine compensation that validates the prophet's ministry and confirms the authenticity of their calling. But this vindication often comes long after the personal cost has been paid. When the warnings you spoke are proven correct, when the judgments you predicted come to pass, or when the spiritual dangers you exposed become obvious to everyone, there's bittersweet satisfaction in being vindicated, but also grief that people suffered consequences they could have avoided if they had heeded God's warnings. The prophet's heart breaks not because they were right, but because people they love experienced avoidable pain due to their rejection of divine guidance. Understanding that prophetic rejection serves to test the prophet's character, purify their motives, and develop perseverance that qualifies them for greater spiritual authority helps sustain them through seasons of opposition while preparing them to speak with increasing authority to larger audiences who desperately need to hear God's voice in critical times. Those chosen to engage in high-level spiritual warfare experience physical, emotional, and spiritual wounds that result from direct combat with demonic forces on behalf of others who are trapped in spiritual bondage. This warfare calling involves more than occasional prayer against spiritual attack. It requires sustained engagement with principalities, powers, and territorial spirits that have established strongholds in individuals, families, communities, or regions. The spiritual wounds that result from this combat are real and often manifest as physical symptoms, emotional trauma, and spiritual exhaustion that can affect every area of your life. Unlike soldiers in natural warfare who can see their enemies and understand their weapons, spiritual warriors often battle invisible forces using spiritual weapons while experiencing very real casualties. The physical manifestations of spiritual warfare wounds include unexplained illness, chronic pain, sudden health crises, and mysterious symptoms that medical professionals cannot adequately diagnose or treat. When you engage demonic strongholds through prayer, fasting, and spiritual warfare, enemy forces often retaliate through physical attack designed to discourage your continued engagement and diminish your effectiveness. These attacks might include respiratory problems when fighting demons of false religion, digestive issues when battling spirits of gluttony or eating disorders, or neurological symptoms when confronting spirits of mental illness or confusion. The connection between spiritual engagement and physical symptoms becomes obvious to experienced warriors, but remains invisible to observers who cannot discern spiritual causation. The emotional toll of spiritual warfare includes experiencing the weight of others' spiritual bondage, feeling the oppression that demons create in their victims, and carrying the burden of persistent prayer until breakthrough occurs. When you engage in warfare for someone's deliverance from addiction, depression, or occult bondage, you may experience their emotional symptoms as if they were your own condition. This empathetic connection serves to motivate persistent prayer and create genuine compassion. But it also means that warriors often carry multiple people's emotional burdens simultaneously while fighting the demons that create those conditions. The accumulated weight of others' pain, combined with demonic retaliation, can create depression, anxiety, and emotional instability that requires supernatural grace to manage. The spiritual exhaustion that characterizes intensive warfare results from sustained spiritual exertion that drains your spiritual, emotional, and physical reserves. Effective spiritual warfare requires prolonged prayer, fasting, worship, and spiritual concentration that depletes human energy while engaging supernatural forces. When battling territorial spirits or generational strongholds, the warfare may continue for months or years before breakthrough occurs, requiring consistent spiritual investment that affects your ability to maintain normal life activities. The exhaustion goes beyond physical tiredness to include spiritual weariness that affects your ability to hear God clearly, maintain faith confidence, and engage in normal spiritual activities that usually provide refreshment and encouragement. The misunderstanding and criticism that warriors receive from other believers adds social isolation to the physical and spiritual wounds of warfare engagement. Many Christians are uncomfortable with warfare ministry and may criticize your involvement as unnecessary, dangerous, or spiritually presumptuous. Religious leaders who don't understand warfare calling may discourage your ministry or question your spiritual maturity, while family members may pressure you to reduce your spiritual intensity to be more normal in your Christian expression. This lack of understanding from people who should provide support creates additional emotional pain that tests your commitment to your calling and your willingness to continue serving as a warfare specialist despite social pressure to conform to more conventional ministry approaches. The breakthrough joy and lasting freedom that result from successful spiritual warfare provide divine compensation that makes the wounds worthwhile and motivates continued engagement despite personal cost. When someone receives deliverance after months of warfare prayer, when territorial strongholds are broken and entire communities experience spiritual awakening, or when generational curses are destroyed and families are liberated from patterns of bondage, the joy of victory exceeds the memory of battle wounds and confirms that your suffering served eternal purposes. The freedom that others experience through your warfare investment often includes their own calling to warfare ministry, creating multiplication that advances God's kingdom and liberates increasing numbers of people from spiritual bondage. Understanding that warfare wounds are temporary prices paid for eternal victories helps sustain warriors through difficult battles while developing spiritual authority that enables them to engage increasingly powerful demonic forces and secure greater levels of freedom for others who are trapped in spiritual bondage that only sustained warfare prayer can break. Those chosen for significant kingdom advancement often experience what could be called sacrifice syndrome, the cumulative pain that comes from repeatedly surrendering personal desires, dreams, and preferences to serve God's purposes that may require giving up everything you value most. This syndrome develops over time as God asks for increasingly costly obedience that systematically removes natural supports, familiar comforts, and human securities that most people consider essential for happiness and stability. The pain intensifies because these sacrifices are often misunderstood by others who cannot comprehend why anyone would give up obvious blessings and opportunities to serve abstract spiritual purposes that may not produce visible rewards or recognition. The financial sacrifices required of God's chosen ones often include giving up lucrative career opportunities, stable employment, and material comforts to pursue ministry calling that provides little financial security or advancement potential. When God calls you to full-time ministry, missionary service, or kingdom business that operates on supernatural provision rather than guaranteed income, the financial pressure can create stress that affects your family's security and your ability to provide for basic needs. The pain increases when you watch others prosper materially while you struggle financially due to obedience to divine calling that seems to penalize faithfulness rather than reward it. This financial testing serves to develop faith in God's provision while eliminating dependence on human security systems. The relational sacrifices that accompany God's calling may include giving up friendships that hinder spiritual growth, ending romantic relationships that conflict with divine direction, or accepting family misunderstanding that results from choosing God's will over human expectations. When God's calling requires geographic relocation, lifestyle changes, or ministry focus that separates you from supportive relationships, the loneliness can be overwhelming. You may find yourself isolated from people who shared your interests, values, and life experiences, while being required to build new relationships with people who understand your calling, but may not share your background or natural personality compatibility. The pain of losing meaningful relationships while uncertain about finding adequate replacements tests your commitment to God's purposes above human companionship. The comfort sacrifices include giving up familiar environments, predictable routines, and lifestyle preferences that provide psychological security and personal satisfaction. God's calling may require living in difficult locations, accepting challenging circumstances, or embracing lifestyle simplicity that conflicts with your natural preferences for comfort and beauty. When divine assignment requires you to live in poverty-stricken areas, dangerous neighborhoods, or culturally unfamiliar environments, the adjustment period can create stress that affects your physical health and emotional well-being. The sacrifice of comfort serves to develop spiritual priorities while eliminating dependencies that could hinder your effectiveness in serving others who lack the luxuries you've enjoyed. The dream sacrifices that characterize chosen ones often involve surrendering personal ambitions, career goals, and life plans that seemed good and achievable, but conflict with God's purposes for your life. When God's calling requires abandoning plans for marriage, family, career advancement, or personal achievement that you've worked toward for years, the grief of surrendering these dreams can feel like death of hope and identity. You may struggle with questions about whether you're missing God's will, whether the sacrifices are necessary, or whether you're being overly spiritual in surrendering things that God might actually want you to enjoy. The process of distinguishing between selfish ambition and legitimate desires requires spiritual maturity and ongoing surrender to God's wisdom above human understanding. The purpose revelation that eventually emerges from cumulative sacrifice shows that everything you surrendered served to prepare you for greater spiritual authority, ministry effectiveness, and eternal reward that exceeds anything you gave up. The financial sacrifices developed faith in supernatural provision that enables you to trust God in impossible circumstances and teach others to depend on divine resources rather than human systems. The relational sacrifices created emotional availability for kingdom relationships that advance spiritual purposes and provide fellowship with people who understand your calling and share your eternal values. The comfort sacrifices developed spiritual resilience that enables you to serve effectively in any environment while maintaining joy and peace that don't depend on external circumstances. The dream sacrifices eliminated competing priorities that would have limited your availability for God's purposes while creating space for divine dreams that exceed human imagination and produce eternal impact. Understanding that every sacrifice serves to prepare you for greater spiritual authority and effectiveness helps sustain you through seasons of loss while developing unshakable confidence in God's wisdom and ultimate justice that ensures nothing surrendered for His sake will be unrewarded in His eternal kingdom.